Ladies and gentlemen, from opening government, we think that it is an absolute disgrace that the level of financial wealth that you have is literally the deciding factor, one of the most key deciding tipping points as to whether or not you are innocent or you are guilty. 3 arguments. Firstly, why that is principally legitimate. Secondly, why specifically it is that having higher paid, more effective lawyers leads to better outcomes for you. And thirdly, why this is a massive disincentive and deterrent for particular kind of crimes that rich individuals do. Here is a 3-point mechanism. There will be no such thing as private lawyers for defence, criminal situations. Rather, they will all work for the state now, and they can all specialise in various different kind of areas. That is to say, if you are very good at assault or sexual assault or whatever, then we think that we can aggregate you in those specific kinds of instances. Secondly, we will pay individuals largely the same way, except with the current state individuals that we have just now, like paralegals, we happen to have a reasonably large, sizable pay increase, and even some individuals who are at the very, very top and want them to come over, we're happy to pay reasonable amounts or reasonably similar. Some of them, like most of them, will come over because they love their job and they like money, and often, and even if they don't, that will be only a very few number of individuals. Okay, argument 1. Why then is it principally illegitimate for wealth to be the main determining factor as to whether or not you get off with a crime? The first thing to point out here is that it is just intuitively not fair, right? As in, the idea as to whether or not you have committed a crime, no, in situations like this, should be whether or not you committed the crime, right? The fact as to whether or not you had a lawyer or didn't have an exceptional lawyer should not be the difference, because the purpose of criminal justice system ultimately should be to find the right answer. But the second thing under this heading...
Clarification.
Okay.
Presumably, you also include all money spent in furtherance of that defence, not just including the lawyers.
Yeah, fine, presumably. Okay, so... whatever that meant. Second thing here is that notice that the state already uses its own services in situations where you are prosecuting. What does that mean? There is an unbalance here. So if you are the victim's family, you have to have a state, a state prosecutor. But if you're not the victim's family, if you're someone who perpetrated it, who just happens to be rich, you are allowed to have a higher service. That is fundamentally unequal. But thirdly, why is it wealth specifically that we think is the problem? Because often, obviously the comparative here, right, is that randomly some people will still get these good lawyers, like randomly in situations where the state's spread them. Why specifically, though, is it worse that it's wealth? Because wealth tracks privilege. The fact is that if you are rich, you are far less likely to be a minority. You are far less likely to be female. You are far less likely to be in a situation of privilege and of power. So even if the comparative is that sometimes randomly these lawyers are randomly dispersed amongst individuals, it's far better that that is done randomly, but Neve will explain why it won't be, because it improves the whole system, right? But in situations where it is like that, wealth is a far much more pernicious metric for that in situations, because it ultimately tracks power. Second argument, why then does the better quality of your lawyer mean that you have a huge advantage in the legal system? Because obviously the intuitive thing here is to point out that they are just better lawyers, but why specifically is that important? Recognise that the vast majority of legal systems across the Western European world operate under what's called an adversarial system. What does that mean? There are situations, don't worry you're buying Glasgow, this is murdering your case. The main reason is because ultimately what happens is the whole point of an adversarial system is, by its nature, it's two sides competing and arguing the truth, right? You don't actually look for the truth. In fact, the way it's described in legal textbooks is that the judge is like a tennis umpire, because in those kind of situations, Duncan, we read the same books, in those kind of legal situations, right, it's not actually about finding the truth. You don't actually inquire. So what happens is the quality of your lawyers will necessarily, in that conflict and in that fight, be the one that is necessarily more likely to tip the advantage in your favour. Why is that? A whole host of reasons. The first thing to point out here is they are far better trained, no thanks, in these kind of situations. They're far much more familiar because they're ultimately paid more. The second thing to point out is that in the adversarial system that we live in, often very random and arbitrary factors are the very things that leads to that decision, because by definition, right, cases that get to court tend to be very close. So in those kind of situations, the ability that you have to spin a jury, to play off the emotional, prejudices of that jury, that only comes from training. That only comes from the wealth of experience that you get when you're paid far more. But the next thing to point out here is that in these kind of situations, even judges, right, because quite a lot of criminal cases aren't ultimately decided by juries, even in those sort of situations stay standing. Just having a familiarity with that judge, just being in more high court cases or more middle court cases and knowing what that judge is, knowing what her preferences are, knowing how she likes to decide, is a huge advantage that state lawyers simply do not have. Go.
Is there an objectively correct answer to any criminal case?
Yes. It has been decided by the law. Whether or not they did it would be one. But even insofar as it's ambiguous and they've reached court, we'd rather that the outcomes were not awful and stacked to you in situations where you happen to have more money. That was odd. So, by the end of this point, by the end of these 2 points, what have we actually proven? We've proven to you that it's principally illegitimate for wealth to be that defining factor, and I've given you the comparative as to why, even in situations where we think that they're going to be randomly distributed, we would just rather that was random, and explain to you specifically why being able to afford that lawyer gives you a substantial advantage. The next thing to say here is kind of white-collar and business crime, and why we think this policy helps this. Because recognise that in these specific instances, the threat of going to jail, or the threat of being fined massively, is a huge deterrent as to whether or not you manipulate that currency speculation, or whether or not you do any of these other kind of things. What's the difference here? Because in these sorts of specific cases that wreck the lives of millions of people financially, by the way, look at what George Soros did in Lithuania, there's even more of an advantage for you in these kind of cases. Why is that? Because there's a much more niche specialisation that the private sector can have. That is to say, the resource misallocation is so much more than the state, because there's a finite amount of resources. And it's not just the fact that it's finite, because the state is fighting on multiple different battles, it's much more difficult for the state to actually be able to accommodate for that. So if you can afford that lawyer to specialise in one particular niche of, white-collar crime defence or whatever, that means that the likelihood that you're going to get off, particularly if you have familiarity with that lawyer and they know your circumstances, is significantly increased. When you stop this, when you have an equal legal system where you do not know that you're going to get the highest quality of lawyer, that is a huge deterrent from you not committing these kind of crimes, because you don't have that guarantee, because you've got enough over and over again, because these crimes are particularly complicated, even for very well-reasoned judge like Lord Hope, because he gets it wrong all the time, and like juries. At the end of this debate, this is comparative as to whether or not we want a world in which literally the price on your head is the determining factor, or one of the huge determining factors as to whether or not you're innocent or guilty. They say that is a disgrace, and Strathclyde are incredibly proud to propose.
Just before I start, they've taken my flag. They have taken my identity. I want it back, Neve. All right. Sorry, I'll stop. Woo. I promise I'm not cheating for Chris. Okay, so what are we defending on side opposition? So we're defending the claim that individuals have a prior right to defend themselves, and this trumps any of the consequentialist benefits Joe tried to give you. Second, we think the consequence of their policy, a massive brain drain effect on criminal defense. Third, we think there are massive perverse incentives in cases against the state. And fourth and finally, we think in the adversarial system, which as Joe points out exists, there is a massive public interest in ensuring the highest quality of legal discovery. First, just some things as far as frameworking this debate and explaining what we do defend on side opposition. So one, Joe wasn't entirely specific on setting, but given this is a debate with all Iona debaters and many teams with lawyers in, we think we're probably defending something based on the common law system. I won't bore you with differences between Scottish and legal systems, but in English systems, broadly speaking, we're probably not saying this in like France, which is too weird to have this debate in. Second, sorry to the French people. They don't really have juries and stuff, it's weird. Anyway, so what we do stand for is a massive increase in spending upon legal aid, right? We think that legal aid takes the form of the state providing money to private firms to take on cases that wouldn't otherwise be taken. We don't think it's the case that, Joe is right and some cases are defended by people that don't have lawyers. We think if that's the case, then we're happy enough to fund any amount of money to avoid that being the case, because we think everyone has a right to self-defense. Second, we support systems like is found in Scotland, where the prosecution is actually drawn on secondment from those private systems as well, because we don't think it's good for the state not to have very high high-quality lawyers either, and we think that it's good to have some degree of balancing between the private criminal lawyers and the state criminal lawyers by bringing some of those private criminal lawyers into the state system. We think that means you get a better quality of law overall. We think we support tough, well-funded prosecution and investigations of white-collar crime. I mean, Joe, it could be the case that we could cap the amounts that were spent on these cases if Joe was right, but he's obviously wrong, right? White-collar crime gets prosecuted all the time. We think given you don't know whether you're going to get successfully prosecuted, the deterrent effect obviously exists. Also, generally speaking, firms will fire you because normally the crime you're committing is embezzlement, and they have reasons not to exactly support that. Finally, just in terms of jurisprudence, we are jurisprudentially neutral in this debate. Broadly speaking, we're positivists. But it is not the case that adversarial systems do not care about legal truths. The whole point of an adversarial system is you have two sides who are well-funded and well-motivated to try and pursue finding out what the truth is. We think that ultimately, legal truth is a matter of finding out what the law says. We think that the problem on their side is they assume that anyone who successfully gets away with a case has gotten away through a loophole. We think if those lacunae in the law exist, then that is what the law is. And if you can find those lacunae, you're entirely entitled to defense. In terms of rebuttal, so they said you might get off just because you have more money. We think this is obviously false. We think we have judges. We think we have juries. We think those juries aren't just able to decide cases on a whim. They have to give reasons. They have to be responsive to the arguments the lawyers give. We're happy enough to dismiss juries that are asking stupid questions like about Christians, wife's sex life, or religious beliefs. Then he said, well, what about the victim's family? Right, two responses. So one, that presumes guilt on part of everyone on trial for a criminal case. Second, though, we think that the bigger issue is false positives, right? We think the state's duty here, not just interest, state's duty is to ensure that there aren't people who are the victims of the state monopoly of violence because they aren't able to fund successfully the defense against themselves. We think that's more important than the feelings of victims. We think that's represented in other areas of the legal system as well. So first, we think individuals have a prior right to defend themselves. We think property is dispossessed all the time in self-interest, and given, despite what Joe might have wanted to do, they didn't prop full communism, we say that they are defending a large number of the status quo where we do that, where we spend on education in order to better ourselves to the mutual exclusion of others. We spend on security, despite the fact that this might have strange incentive effects on the police to maybe defend certain areas other than others. Even the NHS still has BUPA alongside it, right? So we think at the point where we have a minimum safety net threshold of people providing adequate legal defense for people, we think that it's not enough to say, well, rich people sometimes get off with committing crimes. Yeah, they do, Joe, but here's the thing. At the point where you defend people being able to use their property in their self-defense in other cases, why is it not legitimate to use it in the most important cases, where they are facing the entirety of the state, trying to put them in prison for the rest of their lives, perhaps for a crime they didn't commit? We think in those cases it's an entirely rational decision to spend a large amount of your property in order to fund your defense, and we haven't really heard a sufficient reason engaging with that deontological argument to justify the op bench. Second, though, we think the practical consequence of their policy is a massive brain drain in criminal defense. One notes this happens before entry, because at the point where there is less options available within law, I'm less likely to take law as a subject. But second, more importantly, within the profession, notes that Joe is right that criminal lawyers specialize, but guess what? So do all lawyers, right? So we think at the point where you are a potentially talented lawyer, your decision to go into criminal law is massively decreased relative to your decision to go into corporate law. We think this incentive already is a problem, which is why prosecution tends to be quite low. We happily support scholarship to try and abbreviate that, but it notes the consequence of this is there's much less money in the criminal system on their side of the house. The consequence of this is, at the point where you're competing against well-oiled private firms, there is a massive talent drain within the profession. We think that has three obvious problematic consequences. So one, we think it harms everyone at the point where the prosecutors and judges are also drawn from that same private pool. We think that the law society becomes less incentivized in order to try and defend the interests of criminal law and generally. And we think that just generally speaking, the quality of criminal defense decreases, and a lot of the rest of the case is going to be impacting that harm go closing.
Why is it we don't let people pay for a better, is still unbiased judge, or would you be okay with that?
No, we don't support bribing judges. What is this? I mean, look, we think that judges are independent. There is pointed on merits. There is a strong professional incentives within the system. But look, what are the incentives within their system? So at the moment, advancement within the legal profession is the basis of your success in defending clients, right? You have massive reputational benefits if you do this successfully. On their side, the only employer within criminal legal systems is the state. That means your incentive, especially in cases where the state is the person you are fighting against, is to kowtow to that state in in order to be able to achieve advancement. We think the consequence of this means that you have, less incentive to engage in what they might call dirty tricks, but we call pointing out loopholes under which my defense is justified and the state's use of monopoly of violence against me is not, massively decrease. And we think the consequence as a whole is that people are generally speaking less able to avail themselves of better legal protection, whether they are rich or whether they are poor. Why is that true even in the case of poor people? Because we think that especially in common law jurisdictions, when it is about finding the truth, there is a massive public interest in having the best funded capacity to legally to discover what legal truth is. We think the consequence of their side is that neither side is particularly well funded or well equipped, and therefore it's less likely you get good quality law coming out. Note that law is one of the few areas that truly does have a trickle-down effect, right? Because once precedent is set by a case which was the result of a well-funded legal team finding a sensible defense for why I was able to engage in a certain state and resisting the state's interest to, for example, empower the police in terms of having better investigatory powers, we think in terms of that balance, poorer people are able to avail themselves of better legal protections against the state's use of violence by the fact that precedent is set by well-funded legal teams run by rich people. We think on their side, the police become much more powerful, and we think that's something much more worried about. You should be much more worried about in this debate. We're very proud, on behalf of Top Half Scotland, to oppose.
speech, we'll look at two things. First of all, the comparison between inequality and wrongful convictions, engaging with all the stuff we get out of opening government. And second of all, the importance of very expensive landmark breakthrough defences. First of all, recognise we don't get any response to the principled stuff that Duncan brought you in his speech about a prior right to self-defence. The engagement is just the point here is that if you're rich, you're perfectly capable to spend more money to make your home more secure, to protect yourself better. We don't see why this legitimacy doesn't extend also into the legal sphere. Neve's only response is to say, yes, but this right is denied to some people on the status quo. What we're going to show you is why this is better extends to people on our side of the house than theirs. One reason for this is because precisely the point that Neve raises when she says, look, that you no longer have competition with other lawyers. So you can now share your dastardly tactics and just tell everybody else. But this also means you now have no incentive to be the best lawyer. The reason that experienced defence lawyers and expensive defence lawyers, are so good is because they are absolute workaholics that put an unreal amount of effort in. When you no longer have an incentive to be better than the next person, it's not clear why some people are going to be willing to go above and beyond. Recognise also the systemic racism point we get at the end of that speech. Presumably falls insofar as if you think that systemic racism exists, then it's probably worse at the point at which now all defence lawyers now become complicit in that by being employed by the same people that you're accusing of being systemically racist. But let's engage with the main clash, right? So what's the key stuff we get out of government? Like, once they get past telling us, shockingly, that better lawyers are better, their case boils down to inequality being bad. No thank you. We agree, obviously, that inequality is bad, but we don't think that's the only metric upon which you can judge this debate. We think wrongful convictions are also obviously incredibly bad for all of the reasons that Neve tells you. So what is the question before the court in a criminal case? The question is, has something been proven beyond reasonable doubt? Now, if better lawyers are giving different answers than worse lawyers, clearly the people getting worse lawyers are getting a lesser access to justice, therefore more likely to get wrongful convictions, okay? So this means the cheap lawyers are causing damage. So you think you get more wrongful convictions on prop. Why? This is compounded by the brain drain effect, which also isn't responded to by Neve. She just says that, look, like some people are already trained in law, but clearly that's short-termist thinking. Clearly at some point new people have to decide whether they want to be trained in law. Those people will stop doing it. Moreover, once you're already trained in law, this now distorts your calculus away from joining specifically legal defence. You're more likely to move to London and do commercial law, like all the terrible people that choose to do that. No thanks. Now, but the only way that they can stop this happening is to massively increase the amount of money that they give to legal aid. Now, first of all, that's possibly inconsistent with their case insofar as they think that money distorts the truth. But even if they want to do that, we are doing that as well. The difference is, if we have the same pot of money, we can do better in terms of funding the same people. Because they have to fund 100% of cases. We have to fund a number that is less than 100%. Therefore, the same amount of money can buy slightly more expensive lawyers for all of the people that need state lawyers on your side of the house. Insofar as you accept that more expensive lawyers are better, more likely to get to a correct answer, then we deliver better justice for everybody that can't afford to pay for their own one on their side of the house. So we say, look, the comparative is, like, sure, everybody probably is more equal in their side of the house, equal in having a higher chance of getting a wrongful conviction, but when you have a much reduced chance of that on our side of the house, albeit with a slight advantage for rich people, but we think in a world where rich people have many other systematic advantages already, what's another one? If we can show that this benefits literally everybody on our side of the house. No thanks. In fact, I'll take closing, actually.
Okay, if you say that we can't maintain standards of the lawyers employed by the state, then why isn't it a terrible travesty that all prosecution lawyers are employed by the state?
No, that's not the comparative at all. The point is, like, on a comparison, like state offenders clearly get paid less money. Like, this is not what the debate's about. Look, the substantive point is really important here, right? Look, we think it's incredibly important that we have landmark breakthrough defences on our side of the house. We think this is the real clash in this debate, because the key difference between the two sides is on our side you have a very small minority of people spending a huge amount of money on their defence to prevent this. We have a few examples here, most famously the O.J. Simpson case. Now this is probably the sort of case that Prop consider as purchasing innocence, but what really happened in that case? This was a highly funded defence team which spent a huge amount of money on fishing expeditions doing investigatory work. They retested blood samples, DNA samples at great personal expense to O.J. Simpson, and they found things that shouldn't have been there. They found preservative agents in the blood that is used to store it. The only logical conclusion of that was that the blood was planted, right? We think clearly it's important that we can discover that you have a police service that are willing to plant blood, but this will never happen on your side of the house, because you cannot convince a state-funded defence team that you need to go on a fishing expedition to see if you can find preservatives in blood. That's clearly not an efficient use of money. You never get this sort of corruption exposed on your side of the house. We think it's important that we can expose the police as cheats and liars. This obviously benefits everybody at the point at which they have to reconsider their practices and do better things. A different example might be the shaken baby cases, which for years were prosecuted based on accepted research and prosecuted very formulaically until an incredibly wealthy couple spent an insane amount of money rerunning the research, hiring lots of experts to look back into this, and they found serious flaws in what was the accepted legal logic of the time. The consequence for this is, you have a comparison where, on proposition, all prosecutions of similar crimes become incredibly formulaic. Everybody treats the same sort of evidence the same sort of way, the same sort of arguments are run. You know when you get X blood sample, that means this. That is never challenged. The difference we get on our side of the house is people with lots of money willing to say, I know that I am innocent, and I have the ability, and as Duncan told you, a legitimate right, to investigate a way to prove this. Once some people are able to take that hit for everybody, this benefits everybody else that follows. We no longer get people prosecuted for shaken baby syndrome on the basis of bogus research because some people were able to come out and do this. We think we win purely on that basis insofar as we expose new flaws in the legal system, but insofar as the Scotland top clash went down, it's a clash where you get slightly more equality on their side of the house, but every single individual is at a greater risk of wrongful convictions because the lawyers are worse. Oppose the motion.
I thank the next leader of the opposition and all the members of it.
Right, so the top half of this debate has been somewhat marginal, mostly because they focus too much on whether having more money gets you a smarter lawyer. We agree that could possibly be true for opposition, but what we want to focus on is that that money doesn't just get you one smart lawyer, it gets you a team of lawyers that can all specialise in specific things at a specific time, therefore getting all the fishing expeditions that they want to defend in first opposition. We tell you that, first of all, we're willing to stand over that some people on our side of the house, because it is randomly allocated, will get a slightly better lawyer, but the disadvantage comes specifically when there is a team behind that, when those resources can buy a team. Two things in this speech. First of all, why there is a state duty to equality and what that looks like in the real world. Because justice exists not to get the right outcome necessarily in a trial, but also to impact people's lives on the ground. And secondly, we're going to talk about specifically how we improve access to trials for victims, why they're more likely to come forward and why that's so important on our side of the house. First of all, though, 3 points of rebuttal that don't fit in. This nonsense from First Op on the brain drain and why it will happen. First of all, if they're willing to say that they have now magically come up with loads of money so that they can fight white-collar crime, we're just going to invest that into these lawyers so that they won't go running to their side. That just is a wash on either side of the house. But also, no thank you, given that civil lawyers are already paid more because they get paid based on the amount of compensation they win for their clients currently in civil trials, we say they've already gone insofar as they're motivated by money. We say oftentimes people actually get involved in the law, like we're telling you this as UCD Law Society. They get involved because they care about getting what is right, they care about getting involved in that as a vocational sense. So insofar as they wanted money, they've already gone to the other side. We would also tell you that many state doctors, for example, are paid by the state, obviously, and therefore don't get much of an incentive in terms of pay rises, but also can't get any money privately. yet they still work hard, yet they still work incredibly long hours and are willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of other people. So we think the argument about not being incentivized to try hard just doesn't make sense. Secondly, on this idea of technicalities, no thank you, they tell you that's a public good. First of all, technicalities happen on either side of the house because, like, insofar as someone finds out, then we will close that loophole afterwards, because Duncan so kindly explains how common law works. So we say, insofar as we find that later on our side of the house, like, that's still not a problem because nobody has availed of that loophole. Loopholes are only a problem insofar as someone gets away with it. We say, on a moral level, it's not fair that only those who can afford the resources behind it get away with those loopholes. Finally, on the issue of, I can't read my own writing. Yes, sorry, corruption within, like, a prosecution service. We think it's extremely rare. The fact that they base their example on O.J. Simpson, like one of the most fantastical trials in the history of any state, shows that that's probably not a very realistic expectation of how this will work. Secondly, though, because everyone is now operating within the state system, a win for the defence team means that you are probably more likely to get that promotion up to assistant state's attorney or whatever it is ahead of the prosecution team. So that incentive, first of all, to help your own client, but also to help your own career, still exists. So we think you will still try and do the best for your client. No, thank you. State duty to equality, because opening government give an extremely compelling case for why unfairness is bad and why unfairness within the judicial system is bad. We're specifically going to be the team that tells you that because the state is prosecuting, it therefore has a duty to ensure that nobody themselves can place themselves above the state, because the comparison we get from opening opposition is that, well, some people spend their money and that will benefit them, potentially at the expense of others. We're still happy to stand over that on our side. This is different. How? Because when you win in a criminal trial, you are not just putting someone else in prison or whatever, or getting off getting off yourself. We say what you're doing is you are placing yourself above the rules of the state insofar as you are getting off because of the rules of a game, where you're getting off on a technicality which they're willing to defend. So what that looks like in the real world is people actually believing that rich people are less inclined to commit crimes because of their backgrounds. What that looks like in the real world is people mistrusting their local law enforcement, people mistrusting their local branches of the police because they believe that if they involve themselves in that police force and if they give information to that police, that'll damage them within their own community, but also won't lead to conviction that the police are seeking because they're so outmatched by the rich person within that court. We think insofar as we see this manifested on the streets, where potentially a white person is less likely to be put in jail for smoking weed than a black person, we think all of that means that those big changes and those big statements by the state at the very top filter down to individuals at the bottom when they see the way that justice system interacts with their daily lives. The reason that is important is because regardless of whether the wealthy now have to deal with far inferior lawyers, the reason that state institutions exist is because they have to be there in order to ascertain truth. George is correct that not all trials find that. We think it is more likely when you don't have people being completely overmatched, so the prosecution simply can't get their side of the story heard fairly because there's such a team of lawyers on the other side. We think having that and having that marked incentive for lawyers and having those unique selling points turns it into a game of we're the people who will find these types of technicalities rather than actually finding truth, which is what will get you promoted in a state system, because you have to be useful to that state going forward. No, thank you. Let's look at how this improves access then to trials for individuals, because we think it's more realistic that because we're talking about resources on our side of the house, because we're talking about teams of lawyers being the problem from closing government, that has a specific impact, not just as first prop say on those who go away under miscarriages justice, but those who wouldn't otherwise come forward. Because we think there are two reasons why victims are now more likely to come forward. First of all, because they are simply just less likely to win on opposition side of the house when there is that team and that resource mismatch. But secondly, because of the intimidation factor of that. At least now on our side of the house, when you, for example, have to prosecute your boss for making inappropriate sexual advances in the workplace, we think you now at least just have to prosecute him rather than prosecuting him and all the resources that a company can put behind that. We think that is far less intimidating for a victim in terms of having those cases heard. The reason that is important is, first of all, I will take you in a second, is because more cases are taken now on our side of the house, but secondly, anything that might involve court is no longer as scary because it could involve a good outcome for you. Yes.
I mean, we still have those kind of cases cross-subsidized by requiring firms to take on things like pro bono work. On your side, where's the incentive or the capacity to investigate things like systemic racism within the police force?
Right. You literally didn't listen to anything I said in rebuttal when I said that people want, first of all, to help their client because they've gotten in it for a vocation. Secondly, insofar as they are self-motivated, because they are now operating in a state system, they will do the best they can to get ahead of that prosecution team because it means they are more more likely to get promoted. Even if that incentive is very slightly lessened on our side, we think it is outweighed by the fact that more people get closer to the truth, as we've explained. The reason that all of that then, in our second point, getting back to that, is important is because we're helping specifically the most vulnerable within that justice system. Yes, certain people shouldn't be sent to jail being not found guilty, but specifically people who put themselves in front of the state and say, I have been wronged by another person, I want you to help me out. It is specifically the state's duty to make sure that is placed fairly within victims. That's why it's more important than what First Prop gave you. Look, ultimately the top half of this debate was essentially marginal because they look at individuals and whether they're smarter if they get paid or have put more resources into themselves. We look specifically at how those resources affect team dynamics, how they can go on more fact-finding missions, and why that's a bad thing, so we're proud to propose.
This was a proposition bench that rested everything on a claim of equality. It rested everything on the idea that it is unjust when poor people are prosecuted to a greater extent than the rich. Here's the problem. It's all contingent on whether or not fewer poor people get prosecuted on their side of the house. Our extension is going to explicitly prove to you why the incentive to prosecute and jail poor individuals is incredibly, disproportionately skewed unfavourably on their side of the house. 2 points of extension. Firstly, why this creates perverse incentives in the allocation and specialization of defence lawyers, why that's a problem. Secondly, why exactly the pool quality decreases overall, many, many more reasons why a higher pool as a whole explicitly helps the most vulnerable. To the first of these issues, on the allocation of defence lawyers. We're going to make the fairly modest claim that different social groups commit different forms of crimes because your background feeds into both your ability and your incentive to commit crimes. Some examples. Joe correctly points out that white-collar crime is disproportionately committed by the rich. He then farcically says that there'll be a deterrent against it now because you won't have a better lawyer, because you won't be able to hire a better lawyer. Probably wrong insofar as most people commit crimes on the assumption that they won't be caught. But secondly, insofar as law in these areas, one of the reasons these crimes are common is explicitly because the law in these areas is so murky. Financial techniques evolve so fast that it's incredibly difficult for regulators to keep track of them, and they have very little incentive to do that insofar as the people who donate to political parties tend to work overwhelmingly in the banking sector. And in those circumstances, right, white-collar crime probably doesn't fall on their side of the house. But it's also less extreme examples. It's also things like tax evasion. It's also things like recreational drugs, which are qualitatively different and also prosecutorially different insofar as they don't have mandatory minimums if you're a white, rich male. And and finally, many rich people just get done for things like minor violations in employment law. Contrast that with the types of crimes, and therefore by extension the types of defence which are most needed by the most vulnerable. Individuals who have been subject to gang coercion, no thanks. Individuals who are victims of vast waves of socio-economic crime. Individuals who are convicted of different forms of drug convictions which carry explicitly higher sentences. These are very, very subtle issues. They are very, very nuanced issues, and they are harder to, and they are qualitatively different in terms of the defense methods required to the forms of crime committed by the rich. The point being that you need to be a different type of lawyer, a different specialized type of lawyer if you're going to defend a poor person as opposed to defending a rich person. Note, the state chooses that specialization because the Justice Department, local government and legislative policies explicitly set targets and set programs for the types of defense which are prioritized. They explicitly basically do the training programs which ensure that defense lawyers specialize in particular things. Here's the problem. They make that process of allocation, that process of specialization, explicitly zero-sum. Every lawyer trained on their side of the house in race sensitivity, in responding to police brutality, in defending individuals against accusations of gang coercion, every single one who the state trains in that area on their side of the house is a person taken away from a team that could help the rich. Every single one of the people who is trained to help the most vulnerable is now explicitly taken away from the richest in society. Obviously, that doesn't happen on our side insofar as the rich just hire private lawyers for all the reasons that these guys tell you. Their case literally depends on that link. How exactly does this policy skew funding away from the individuals and the specializations that help the most vulnerable? As many teams that I've had the pleasure of encountering at this competition have told me, governments tend to be captured by elites. There are 4 ways in which this happens. Firstly, no thank you. Insofar as lobbying exists and large sums of money get you in rooms with politicians because you can make implicit or explicit promises of donation to those individuals, you tend to be the sort of person who has frequent conversations with politicians and is able to get policies passed through which are intensely beneficial to you. That's why you've had no reform on political finance. That's why you've never been able to successfully regulate the banking sector. It is just true that rich individuals are good at skewing government programs in their own favors. Secondly, insofar as the people who make the decisions as to what specializations are important tend to come from privileged backgrounds because it is easier to be appointed to a government position if you are from a position of privilege, the experiences of those civil servants and those officials will just more strongly suggest that the types of crime that the types of training programs that help the rich are more important. Thirdly, the popularity of government tends to rest on the rich and the middle class for the simple reason that they vote more and governments are continually incentivized to appeal to that group. Fourthly, any political capital to reform the system and specialize defense lawyers more, and specialize defense lawyers to a greater extent on crimes that help the most vulnerable. In those circumstances, the political capital for them to be able to specialize in this way vanishes. Why? Because this will be a hugely unpopular policy which will guarantee that literally no one wants to reform the criminal justice system ever again because it's a toxic issue. It's one of the most controversial issues and no politician has an incentive to go near it. Why? For all the reasons opening opposition told you about self-defense. Even insofar as you think any of those arguments are slightly plausible, they will probably be believed by some people, at which point this is a vastly unpopular policy. Just get Duncan Crowe. Well, I mean, this debate's being streamed, right? They'll know all of it. They'll know why this is a terrible and unjust idea in those circumstances, hugely unpopular. I will take opening.
The only difference is that the service never gets back to lawyers. We told you why all lawyers approved
the rich on our side of the house don't use the public defense system. So in those circumstances, it's not a zero-sum game because the rich have an opt-out at literally every single point. In the circumstances where it's explicitly zero-sum, all the incentives are very much skewed towards, my extension. Okay, so why exactly does the quality of the pool of lawyers fall? Why is the brain drain argument true? A reasonable, simple motive that as much as they might like to talk about feelings and fluffiness and self-esteem as an individual, all of that tends to be contingent on, having some money, and people like money, and people's families continually pressure them to make more money. The state is incredibly systemically underfunded in terms of funding defense lawyers, and in those circumstances, defense lawyers are incredibly hard to pay for all the reasons I've outlined earlier. In those circumstances, the brain drain absolutely exists. In those circumstances, you will just get a lower quality pool overall. You will just have more people behind bars. At the end of this debate, the rich are able to opt out of the system under the status quo. And that ultimately means they cannot skew the system. They cannot skew the system in all the unjust ways they mention. And ultimately, all of their impact fall to us. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition and call the government whip.
First, I'm going to explain how this debate is likely to change the system of lawyers, and second, I'm going to explain why the state has a principal duty to pass this motion. Before I do, about this extension, first off, I do doubt him on how much rich people control the courts, since apparently we're meant to have independent judiciaries, and we can actually have things like public prosecutors, and equally you could set up systems. If you can have an independent judge, why can't you also have somebody who will actually act for their client? But more importantly, my actual response is that there is not an incentive for rich people, even if they were able to change it, because every single person who I train in the area to defend me in white-collar crime could equally prosecute me. There is just no incentive of having incredibly great lawyers who are there to fight my corner in that. Anymore, there's an incentive for everybody to have equality and a fair system. They just haven't proven that it is in their interests, therefore it's unlikely to happen. How is this going to affect the system? First off, they say all your lawyers will run away. Brain drain. Because people like money. Look, I do miss debates where we could just fund money into it as opposed to other ridiculous things like debating competitions that states fund. But equally we would point out that they specifically say that they will give resources to that, to certain areas in law. We have seen no reason why it would not be reasonable, no thank you, to use that money to fund the entire system. Note that the comparative our side is that you are reasonably paid as a lawyer, that you do have an awful lot of money. But this is the same argument for not publicizing anything. Doctors, for example. They don't run away when you have a public health system, and there are still doctors who are willing to work specifically within a public health system, specifically good ones. We don't think the problem is not that all of the amazing lawyers have run away. The problem is that I can hire an awful lot more lawyers when I'm allowed to hire lawyers at all. That's why Paul's extension was more important. Second, they say, right, you are unlikely to have a good barrister or a good lawyer because we're not able to set any standards. First, we have things like exams, and we will kick them out. We will give that minimum standard to literally anybody. That is the right you have in terms of a fair trial. But the difference is that you have an imbalance. When they say things like everybody has to have a right to get away on technicalities, note that technicalities and loopholes were specifically not intended in the law. That is not a just or a moral reason for you to get out of crime. Specifically, when we find them, we then change the loophole so nobody else can get out of that crime. It is not some sort of right that you have to play this like a game. That is also the moral response to why is it I can buy a nice house and defend it, but I can't use it to screw over other people's justice system because other people rely on that justice system. Sure, benefit yourself, but it is a nonsense that you can fuck over other people specifically for you. Right. When they say then, why is equity most important? First, I have to tell you, Danny Crane from Boston Legal wins all of his cases. If I had him, it is likely that I would get off trials. We agreed in second half, but we point out that Danny Crane doesn't exist, and in fact it is not that there is one genius barrister. The fact is that when you can employ lawyers at all, you can employ a massive amount of those people. Why is that important in extension? First, because it actually sidesteps the issue that OP have in terms of now it's randomized, and that's really unfair, because it's not. Everyone has this base standard that you are able to get. Everyone will have a minimum standard barrister, but there is no maximum amount of barristers or lawyers that you can hire. It's not that one person is a genius, it's that they had an entire team trawling through all of the evidence to find that needle in the haystack. Why is that unfair? They say, why is equality important? Because we don't know who is right yet. Because it is unfair to let one side have all of the advantage. Because as we know from debates, truth does not win out. The person who says it best knows the most resources from that and puts the most into it and did the most research and fact-filing, no thank you, often wins. That is not a fair way to run a justice system. That is not helpful. Then they say technicalities are important because, man, does it develop laws. In Ireland a while back, we found a loophole where in fact it was actually wrong for us to prosecute any drug users. The response was not, that is fascinating, I love how the law has developed, let us move forward. It was, Christ, let's fix that. Those loopholes themselves are not a development or an academic progression of that law, or something that we want anyone else to ever get away with. No, thank you. I think OJ equally is a case where people mostly think that wasn't truth winning out. No, thank you. But they say that in a more nuanced point, that the actual case they have is that you will avoid abuses in the police system. Like, here's why that isn't true. First, because Paul explained that this is not an effective fail-safe. There are other fail-safes that you have for your police system. There are oversights that should be regulating it, and if you're relying on this specific case, you have a far bigger problem than our proposition. But next he points out that these are still good people. Like, they do still care about the client that they are working with. They do largely want to help them, no thank you, they have incentive. And also, they love a pay raise. Like, as long as we keep randomly allocating these lawyers, we can absolutely pay some more than others, as we do in every other public sector. You have a direct personal incentive to be the best lawyer there, obviously. Next point, why is it the state necessarily has to implement this? No thanks. First, why is it? Because Paul explained that people won't take cases. First props say that there is likely to be less crime committed. We agree, but the response is, oh, but sure, it's low impact, because courts often don't impact some people because they have different incentives. Like, if it's true that courts don't impact all people, then we would probably say that, like, that's just a reason not to consider it as much in what courts do. But more importantly, we would point out, and the reason our extension is more important is because courts never stop that crime happening. They can never take away the hurt that you felt. They are there to give you justice. That is why it is a bigger harm and a worse harm in closing when we tell you that some people feel they can never take a case. They feel that they know there is a loss. They know that when they go and put themselves out there, they will be questioned on the stand and they will have to go through all of it, and then the rich guy will win. Then they'll have to go away with literally nothing. We change that incentive. They say they fix it when they pump more money in. We say, first off, we can put equal money in, but the issue is not that, like, technically it would work on their side. They can't put money in specific cases because they don't know which ones to put into at the start unless they fully fund all lawyers like our proposition. But secondly, we point out that there's an impression, an idea that he will have good lawyers and I will be with the state. That is the specific problem that locks people into cages after they've had crimes committed. Second impact after he says this, yeah.
Okay, so the problem with your side is both that the state decides what the best is and also limits the amount that can be spent on investigations, which means you don't have anything like investigations of systemic racism or evidence planting on your side. It's not revenue neutral because you have the same amount of money for legal aid as we do, but not that investigation.
Okay, courts are not there, like, it's like my specific trial, my trial between me and another person, or me and another person who hurt me, is not the fail-safe for the police. It is an abuse for you to try to use it in that manner, and it is not an effective one, as Paul already explained, in terms of looking after police. The second specific impact is that people have to live their lives feeling like the state is not on their side. Recognize the impact of Paul's analysis when people literally are afraid of the police. When African Americans in America feel like the state, the people who have power to lock them up in prison and literally could break into their houses and arrest them, are against them. When the entire system is stacked against your favor, both courts as well. This is the only relief from that. Courts is the only place where we come together as equals, and men who are gods can be put in shackles. That's taken away when you remove equality, and that's the principal justification why equality is so important on our side. Look, at the end of this debate, it's not about there's some genius magical lawyers who could get anybody else off. The problem is that some people are allowed to hire an entire team of people to work for them. Some people are left with one lawyer given by the state. This is unfair and principally not acceptable. Proud to propose.
Great, thanks very much. I love you too. That's the worst response to I love you. Okay, ready? Okay, 3 things in summary today. First of all, going to clash heavily on the idea of moral legitimacy and should we allow people to do this. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about how this policy changes the pool of defense lawyers compared to status quo. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about how this impacts some of the most vulnerable people, all drawing from George's extension, right? Okay, straight off that, and all rebuttal integrated. Okay, first of all, in terms of moral legitimacy, so we can see that what these guys say is true, right? That it is unfair that the people who have the most money are sometimes able to skew the system or like have the best defense possible or the best defense lawyers possible in order to protect them. The problem with this is, we don't know if that rich person who you're putting on trial is actually guilty. We don't know if that person has committed a crime. To be very clear, if you're sent to prison, it will wreck your life. We don't understand why when an individual, when we allow this under literally every other aspect of their life, right? We allow individuals to be able to prioritize their own safety, to be able to prioritize their autonomy, to be able to prioritize their preservation above all else, and to do so by any means possible. So when you don't know whether that rich person is actually guilty, it is important to be able to offer to them the best package that they can possibly have. If what these guys say is true, right, that private lawyers will always necessarily be the best lawyers, then it is important for us to allow the rich person that. No thanks. Okay, so notice that also that this is very similar to the reason why, despite the fact that we're very happy on opposition to support a thriving public healthcare system, we still allow individuals the right to access private healthcare. No thanks. But secondly, they say, okay, look, it is unfair because it has bad outcomes for different groups of people, and this is fundamentally unjust. So notice that this is a consequentialist framework of thinking, right? So insofar as this is bad outcomes, this is an illegitimate thing. George's extension proves to you why the most vulnerable people under status quo continue to be failed and sort of be hurt a lot more by this policy, which means that if we win that argument, all of the benefits fall away. But finally, and this is really interesting, right? So there's like this massive conflation between class and race and how black people in America respond to aggressive policing. Now there is this problem, right? So when a when sort of a white police officer has an African American man in a chokehold because he was selling cigarettes, it doesn't really matter but there's nothing private or public about the police, right? Those people will never be prosecuted because there are fundamental structures of racism that you do not challenge. They fall outside of this debate. This has nothing to do with whether that black person was rich. I mean, that's literally the reality of race relations in America, right? These problems pre-exist outside the legal system, and moreover, that is the perception. Like no one thinks that killing black people, people don't seem to think that killing black people is a good idea, yet it continues to be perpetuated because it's protected by the law, and police officers are public institutions, right? But okay, more importantly then, why are poor people systematically failed under the system? And this is where George's extension comes in, right? Insofar as closing is being snarky and saying top half was marginal, we concede that, right? Okay. Okay. So how does this actually change the pool of defense lawyers? So we get this case out of opening, which is quite interesting, and then sort of built in closing, right? So then they tell us, look, the reason why this is good is because individuals have no way. High-flying lawyers have better understanding of judges because they occupy the same social spaces or whatever. Notice the fact at which defense and prosecution continue to be extremely important moral questions that sort of perpetuate structures of power anyway, even if you have a homogeneous pool of individuals, all of whom are under the state, these structures are still likely to continue to exist, right? So judges will still know the most privileged of those lawyers who you're now funding under the state. But more importantly, what are some of the other impacts of this, right? First of all, as sort of George explains, and it's also brought out in opening, right? The brain drain effect. Even if it is really marginal, notice the fact that if you're a private lawyer and you're earning about 5 or 12 times more than a public defendant right now, you increase the threshold whereby an individual decides that they want to go into defense, right? Which means that you're necessarily narrowing the pool. You increase the marginal cost that an individual has when they want to take up defense. No thanks. But more importantly, if what Neve says is true, and there is this constant recycling of knowledge within these communities, right? It means that you're never able to produce specializations. You're never able to have interesting things like niche ways or special tactics, right? But most importantly, as George tells you, right, you change the way this acts as a zero-sum game. What does this mean? As George explains to you, the kind of crimes that are committed by rich people and by poor people are often very, very different. The kind of strategies needed to defend these crimes are very different. As George gives you in his examples, rich people are more likely to commit sort of white-collar crimes, right? Or tax evasion and so on and so forth. All of these are problems because there are structural reasons under status quo why it's so difficult to prosecute them for this, right? It is not just to do with the fact that they're extremely privileged. It is also to do with the fact that people just don't understand where the law has slipped and so on and so forth, right? As opposed to that, you want to be able to have a strong pool of individuals who are able to support things like lower mandatory minimums and so on and so forth, right? Or to have better race training, for instance, right? Or to have a better understanding of how police interacts with local communities, right? How does this absolutely change? Okay, and this is really important. No thanks, right? Okay, so what did George tell you? Under status quo, the individuals who require the kind of lawyers who will specialize in getting them out of like white-collar allegations or white-collar crime allegations and so forth will go to private lawyers, which means that the largest pool of people, sort of public defendants, can specialize in specifically the kind of things that we want, right? Specifically lower prosecution for poor people unfairly. Why is this? Because if they're right and they say, like elitism is a problem or like networks are a problem, these are the very same biases and prejudices that exist within the state. Because the richest people have the greatest lobbying power, right? The richest people have the greatest political capital. They will be able to dictate that within this large pool of public defendants that you have, what is the kind of training that you need to specialize in? What is the kind of training that you need? Who are the kind of people that you should be entrusted to protect? Which means that the level of political capital you have for taking care of the poor people who, according to them, like everyone hates, right? Will never ever have there will never ever be a reason for the state to want to protect those people, because there will be greater political capital to try and help people specialize in things that allow rich people to get out of white-collar crimes. George gives you this analysis and gets completely unresponded to. Look, there is a wide range of reasons why having a very good pool of individuals benefits people, because there is knowledge sharing. But ultimately, under status quo, we help the most vulnerable people because the state can protect them. This goes away at the point at which you make this a non-zero sum game. Very proud to oppose.